Hello, welcome to American Government. Today we're talking about Chapter 20, which deals with the future of American politics. This is a very interesting book in the chapter in the Wilson book, because it talks about how American government has changed from basically the 19th century to the 21st century. The main point that they're trying to make in the book is that the federal government has grown tremendously over the last century and a half or so, really over the course of the 20th century. The federal government has expanded at the expense of both state and local government. That is, federal government has taken over more and more responsibility for things that happen within the United States. And as the United States has become more and more involved with the rest of the world, the federal government has had to grow because of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and responses to terrorism and other kinds of international threats that are out there. And so that's what they're talking about in that chapter. So take a look at it. And it talks about how the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch have all expanded their control and power, how the budget has expanded, how the role of the federal government in our daily lives has expanded tremendously, and how we've become more and more aware of the role that the federal government plays in our lives. What I'm going to do today, though, is look forward a bit more than the book does to look at some of the major issues that I think are going to be confronting your generation over the next 10, 20, 30, even beyond that years. So let's get right to it here. First of all, I think the major issue is that climate change is something that we cannot ignore, and it will shape everything that happens in this country and in the world over the next few decades and beyond that. That is, it's going to be the single major development that will affect everything. The science is clear. Climate change is happening. The average temperature of the earth is increasing. It's increasing because of human activity, the burning of fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, natural gas, which are creating CO2 emissions, which are greater than can be absorbed by the planet, with the result that the average temperature is increasing and is having a tremendous effect on all kinds of things, from the weather to salinization of the seas to desertification of forest and agricultural land, all kinds of things like that. The politics of it are still murky, because consider that in the United States, we still have roughly a third of the American population who believes that climate change isn't actually real, or that it's some kind of natural phenomenon that will reverse itself. We have a major party, the Republican Party, that has made it their platform that climate change is not real and that we do not need to respond to it, that it's a hoax and that it's a plot by the Democratic Party to scare people into submission and compliance with their radical left agenda. Well, here's the thing. Global fuel consumption of fossil fuels has increased tremendously. You can see from this chart that we begin about 1800, which is when global warming starts, climate change begins, because that's when humans begin to use coal for industrial production. That is, coal to power steam engines, to mass manufacture various kinds of things like textiles and other things, using coal to power the engines that run factories that can then work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, this continues to the 1850s, when industrialization begins to spread to the United States, Japan, to other parts of Europe, and coal consumption increases tremendously from 1850 to 1900. Then you see around 1900, petroleum begins to be used. Petroleum in the form of oil, gasoline, diesel fuel, which is put into ships for navies, to start with the British Navy, the American Navy, the German Navy, et cetera, because petroleum is a more efficient and lighter and more transportable kind of fuel. And so you get to be used in ships, eventually automobiles, and you can see that that increases steadily until about 1950, when there's a post-World War II economic boom that leads to massive consumption of oil, continuing consumption of coal, and now more and more consumption of natural gas. Oil being consumed primarily for transportation, but also to generate electricity, of which we're using more and more and more of it after 1950. Natural gas being used increasingly in homes around the world and in the United States to heat and to cook. And so all of these three fossil fuels, the consumption continues to rise exponentially from 1950 up until the 2000s there. You can see there's been a slight decline in the use of coal, perhaps crude oil over the last couple of years. There was definitely a decline in 2020 because of the pandemic. And we could see immediately the effects that would happen to the environment if we stop using coal in the form of cleaner air around major cities all over the world. But every year, we consume more fossil fuels. And every year, our carbon emissions are increasing. That carbon is being released into the atmosphere. Trees, green plants absorb carbon dioxide. The oceans absorb carbon dioxide. Fungi and other kinds of things will absorb carbon dioxide. But to maintain a balance, we can't consume the amount of carbon dioxide we are, because we've thrown everything out of balance, with the result that carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere and is causing the average temperature of the Earth to increase. Estimates are that it will increase by about 2 degrees Celsius by the mid 20th century or so. It's about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you take that as the global average, what that means is that in localities, you may have an increase in temperatures, say in the winter of 10, 20 degrees Fahrenheit, so that there's no snow, the ice is melting. And in summer times, you may see increases of 20, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, so that the highest temperatures recorded in places like Los Angeles or Phoenix, Arizona, that could go up from, say, 110 up to 130 or even 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a major change. And it has all kinds of ramifications that you read about in the book and that you probably have been reading about in other courses as well. Here's the thing, global average temperatures, this is a temperature that's measured by thermometers that are placed around the globe, and they measure the temperature constantly at that location. And then what scientists do is they take all the average of those thermometers, and these are placed at the North Pole, the South Pole, they're on mountains, they're in oceans, they're on beach fronts, they're in the deserts, they're in cities, they're all over the place. And so it gives you an average global temperature. Now, it is for a time in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that average temperatures were lower. But that's changed. And says as consumption of fossil fuels increased dramatically after 1950, you can see that there are fewer and fewer years that are below average and more that are above average. And over the last 40 years now, every single year has been above average, and most of those years are more than the previous year. So the temperature is just going up and up and up and up towards 1 degree Celsius. If we hit above 2 degrees Celsius, scientists predict that we will have catastrophic change in our environment. That will mean drastic change in the way we live. And it's going to require massive amounts of change in the way we consume things, the way we live, the way we interact with each other, the way we spend our money, how our economies work, all kinds of things like that, which means that it's going to have massive ramifications for politics, because the government is of any country around the world, governments are going to have to take the lead, I think, in trying to get people to accommodate this change, to try to mitigate the effects of it, or accept it and try to be resilient about the effects of this climate change. Now, what's going to happen when those governments start to respond to this? Will it mean a more equal system, a more democratic system, or will it mean a more autocratic, more unequal system? Will the rich, those billionaires, millionaires, use their money to flee to various places like New Zealand, or onto yachts where they can control their own climate, and basically abandon the planet to people who can't go anywhere and can't do anything except live through this increasingly warm and destructive environment we live in? Okay, so think about politics, US politics here in this context, i.e. back in 2020, before the election, this was who did this, the Center for Climate Change Communication and Center Pew Charitable Trust did a study here and asked people, what do they see as the most important issues among voters for the 2020 election? And you can see the columns here go from all registered voters to liberal Democrats, moderate conservative, moderate Republicans, conservative Republicans. So who rates global warming and climate change as serious as the most important? Liberal Democrats, which make up probably about 15% perhaps of all the American electorate. moderate to conservative Democrats rank global warming as the fifth most important. Republicans, liberal or conservative, don't rank climate change or global warming as among the top 10 at all. Not at all for the 2020 election. For them, it's the economy, border security, gun policies, social security, abortion rights, immigration reform, terrorism, various kinds of things like that. For liberals, it is global warming. For moderates, it's healthcare, social security, the income gap, those kind of things. So you can see that what we've got is an electorate that is very split on the issue of what to do about climate change at this time. There is no consensus. And since you've got a Congress right now that is almost 50-50 in the House and 50-50 in the Senate, what is the government going to do about this? What is Congress going to do about meeting the challenge of global climate change? Joe Biden's Build Back Better program is a large program asking for $3 trillion to be spent by Congress to do things about climate change. Speed up electrification, speed up the use of renewable energy, speed up the process of replacing fossil fuels with things like wind and solar power, building infrastructure that is more resilient and can deal better with climate change. And yet that bill is stalled in Congress because half of the members of the Senate don't believe climate change is a major issue at all. Well, why isn't it considered a major issue? Part of the reason is because of the way this is covered in the media. If you watch the media, if you pay attention to more liberal sources like CNN or MSNBC, you'll notice that there's the occasional story on climate change. On Fox News, not at all. Or it's about climate change being fake news itself, being a conspiracy. And so you've got the media that is unwilling to cover climate change or give it the kind of importance that it deserves and needs. And so you have a citizenry that is being misled or misinformed by its own media about the dangers that we're confronting over the next few decades. So what you think about, look at here, is that you get half of Americans think made up news and information is a critical problem for the country. So there is a recognition among Americans that the way news is being covered is a problem, that there is a lot of propaganda out there, there's a lot of lying, there's a lot of fake news. Now, who's responsible for that fake news? Well, that will depend on whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. You will tend to see it either being CNN who's creating the fake news or it's Fox News who's creating the fake news. But seems to be a bipartisan kind of concern here that people are concerned that we're not getting real news. That's partly to do with social media, of course. How can you get real news from places like Facebook or Twitter, which are not journalistic enterprises? They are whoever wants to post whatever story they want to. And the companies, Meta and Twitter, that run what the content of these programs tend to favor putting up things that are more extreme because people pay to watch those kind of things. All right. Well, if we look at the 2020 election, you can see how divided Americans are. Now, this is a problem going forward, I think, that we do not have a consensus. If you think back in American history, there have been times when there have been a strong majority, either Republican or Democratic, and allowed governments to do things. Think back on the period of the 1920s. The Republicans controlled the White House. They controlled both houses of Congress. They controlled most of the state houses as well around the country. And that gave the Republicans the ability to carry out the kind of legislation that they favored, which was pro-business, lower taxes, reduce regulations, things like that. Then the economy boomed in the 1920s. The Depression comes along, 1929, 1932. The Democrats sweep into power once again, and they take over the White House, both houses of Congress, and they take over most of the state legislatures and governorships as well. And that gives the Democrats the ability then to carry out the New Deal over the course of the 1930s. And that Democratic majority maintains itself all through the 1940s, into the 50s, and into the 60s, when you get Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society programs. So you get those 30 years there, the Democrats carry out various kinds of reforms to build up Social Security, build up the welfare, to make the government play a prime role in trying to deal with problems like poverty, poor education, inequality, those kind of things. Well, in the 1980s, the pendulum switches back, and the Republicans again achieve a majority for a while, at least in the White House and Congress. and they get control of state houses and state legislatures once again. And for the last 40 years or so, it's been the Democrats, or the Republicans, I'm sorry, that have dominated the government at the national, state, and local levels. Well, the pendulum may be switching back again. We'll look at a few reasons for why that might be here. If you look at the 2020 elections, Joe Biden won 51.4% of the popular vote around the country. Donald Trump won about 47% of the popular vote. The other remaining there went to other candidates, Libertarian, Green Party, et cetera. Joe Biden, because of the way the Electoral College works, won 57% of the electoral vote. So his electoral victory is greater than his popular victory was. That's important to remember, because that means that there are a lot of people out there who the state went to Joe Biden, but a lot of people in that state didn't necessarily vote for Biden. You look at the division by counties and lower levels by the states here, you notice that Joe Biden won 25 of the states out of the 50 states, plus he won the District of Columbia. But the thing is that the states that Joe Biden won were states like California, New York, Pennsylvania, have large populations. Georgia is another one. The population represented in the 25 states in the District of Columbia that he won, 179.3 million out of the 320 million people. That's about 58% of the US population. So Joe Biden wins about 51% of the popular vote, gets 57% of the electoral vote, representing about 58% of the total population of the US. But in the 477 counties that Joe Biden won, that's only 16% of all the counties in the US. Think about a county like a state like New York. New York went Democratic, but went Democratic because Joe Biden carried New York. He carried those counties like Westchester. He did carry Dutchess County, where I live. He also carried Long Island. He also carried the boroughs of New York, which accounts for 40-some% of the New York voting population. Out of the 67 counties in New York, most of them went to Donald Trump. Counties upstate, places like Delaware County, and further on up, went to Donald Trump. So Donald Trump won about 84% of all the counties in the United States. But the thing is that he won the counties where population counts are low. Biden won the big counties with big populations. Kansas went for Donald Trump, but Joe Biden won Johnson County, which is the most heavily populated county in the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the 477 counties that Joe Biden won represent about 70% of the US gross domestic product. That means that most of the country's industry, its commercial activities, its financial institutions, its universities are in areas or counties that voted Democratic in the election. The counties that voted Republican in 2020 make up counties where most of the population is engaged in agriculture. They have smaller populations, small towns, more diverse, not more diverse, but more dispersed populations, I should say. So this is a major split that's developed in American politics, which is the, flip to this one, the urban-rural partisanship here. That you look at this map here, it shows all the counties around the United States, and it shows you which counties voted in 2020 for the Republicans, which ones voted for the Democrats, and the more deep red means more higher percentage voted Republican, more deep blue, higher percentage Democratic. You look at these, you look at, say, New York there, you see that it's that area around New York City, up the Hudson Valley towards Albany, and out at Buffalo. I guess that's Oswego up there. Big towns in New York voted Democratic. Small town areas like Delaware County voted heavily Republican. Look down here in the Midwest here, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma. Not a single county went Democratic in Oklahoma. In Texas, you can see those little blue spots here in the north, Dallas, down southeast of that, Houston, west of that, Boston, San Antonio, and then a heavily Democratic area down there along the Rio Grande Valley there. Out in Arizona, it's Maricopa County, a big blue thing there that went Democratic. Out in California, you got the big blue around Los Angeles, San Francisco. Up in the northwest there, Seattle, Portland are all areas that were Democratic. Down in Florida, it was Miami and the counties around Miami that went Democratic. In Georgia, it's Atlanta. So you see how there's developing here this urban-rural split. And you see this chart over here that shows you the percentage of registered voters who identify as either Democratic or Republican. Among urban, the Democratic share is increasing from 53 to 62%. In suburban areas, there's a huge fight going on, and there's a very similar. You got 47% Republican, 46% Democratic in suburban areas. In rural, it's very heavily Republican, 35% Democrats, 58% Republicans. Well, statewise, what this works out to is that the way people are registered to vote in the U.S. in the 2020 election, about 29% of the voters were registered as Democrats, 30% as Republicans, 39% were registered as independent. What does independent mean? In the past, that tended to mean basically Republican. Independents tended to vote for Republicans. Nowadays, that they're basically roughly split. So that people are independent, meaning they don't register as either Democrat or a Republican, but they vote one way or the other generally when it comes to their elections. And Massachusetts is the most heavily Democratic state with 56% of the registered voters as Democrats. Wyoming is the most heavily Republican, 59% registered as Republican, Wyoming. Now the population of Massachusetts is 10 times or more the size of the population of Wyoming. This map also shows you about who controls the states in the United States. In December of 2020, which is when this comes from, the red states here were states where there was full Republican control. Republican governor, both houses of the state legislature controlled by Republicans. Full Republicans controlled 21 of the states. Democratic full control is in 15 of the states. You can see these mostly in New England and the West Coast here, the Republicans mostly in the South, Midwest area there. The full Democratic control means Democratic governor, Democratic House, Democratic Senate in the state. Purple means split control. These are states where you have some version of this, where at least one of those three things, the governor, the assembly, the Senate, are controlled by a different party. And so some of these states have got a Democratic governor, Republican legislature. Some of them you've got a Republican House, Democratic Senate, something like that. And so they're divided there. So those are the states that are up for grabs, it seems, in the next upcoming election. States like Alaska, Georgia is dominated by Republicans right now, but it went for Joe Biden in 2020. Arizona is the same thing. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, these are states that tend to flip-flop back and forth. So we will see what happens in 2022, and we'll see what happens in 2024. So pay attention to the elections coming up. Okay, so what about the longer term, right? So we're clearly in flux right now, that things are changing, that the Republicans seem to be losing their majority control around most of the country. Does that mean that it will flip to Democrats in the next elections? No, that doesn't mean. It's very likely that the Republicans will regain control of the House of Representatives and the US Senate in 2022. And so you'll have a Democratic president with a Republican-controlled Congress that will carry out nothing of his agenda, presumably. And so we'll see what happens in 2024. Will the Democrats come back into power after 2 years of Republican control, or will Republicans be able to retake the White House and have full Republican control over the federal government? We'll see. Well, demographics play a role here, because what's happening is, you see on the chart here to the left, is that the size of the white population in the United States is declining. It's decreasing as a share of the total population. And what this means is that this means a change in the way politics works. Because who is it that are the supporters of the Republican Party? It is heavily supported by white people. About 83% or so of whites above a certain age, about 65, vote Republican. Democrats tend to rely on the voters from ethnic minorities, racial minorities, African American, Latin American, and other Asian Americans are increasingly voting Democratic. And so this is why the demographics matter here, because you see here, this projects forward 2018 to 2020. So total population, see that whites in 2018 made up about 61% of the US population. By 2060, they're going to be a minority. They're going to be less than 45% of the US population. We'll look at the next chart here. It's under age 18. Whites will currently make up about 50% of the US population under 18. By 2060, that's going to be down to about 36%. Among people over age of 65, currently they make up about 75% of the total population. Whites do. But whites are going to be declining down to about 55% of the population over 65 by 2060. So what that means then, by 2060, that whites will be a much smaller percentage of the US population. What Hispanic people will make up a much larger percent, though not a majority of the population. African Americans will continue to make up about 12, 13, 14% of the population. And Asian Americans and multiracial people will increase as a number, as a percentage of the US population. What this means is that the Democrats are calculating that over time, demographics basically are going to wipe out the Republican Party, that fewer and fewer white people will be around to vote for the Republicans. And as a result, the Republican base is a declining minority. The Republicans will have to change their politics in order to start attracting African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. And at the current state, this does not look like this is something the Republican Party is willing to do. If Donald Trump continues to control the Republican Party, it's going to continue to focus on white evangelicals living in the countryside. Well, that's a declining part of the population, and that could mean that the Republicans end up in a permanent minority in the US political system. So what are they doing about it? Well, this is what the Republicans are doing. They came up with a plan in 2008, actually it was on January 20th, 2009, when the first African-American president in US history was being inaugurated. A group of Republican strategists, fundraisers, and leaders met in Washington, D.C., and they came up with a strategy for how to respond to what appeared to be their doom because of demographics and because now of an increasingly liberal Democratic Party that was able to attract minority voters to their side. The Republicans decided that they would adopt a strategy that would lead to permanent minority control of the government. So that they come up with a way of rigging the system, if you will, so that, to use a Donald Trump term, that will give the Republicans a way to control state and local governments and national government without ever having to win more than 50% of the vote. How do you do that? You do that through two kinds of strategies. First of them is gerrymandering districts. The second one is voter suppression. Gerrymandering is the process of drawing up congressional districts so that they give you a certain type of population. The goal of this is to create districts that are what they call safe districts. That is, that it doesn't matter how people vote, there will always be enough people that are of your demographic in that district that you can be assured that your party will always win the seat for that district. Gerrymandering is something that's done by both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and it's done every 10 years. Every 10 years, according to the Constitution, the US government does a census, and it counts everybody living in the United States. And this census is gathered every 10 years, is used to draw the lines for congressional districts. And the purpose of this district, the purpose of the census is to figure out where the population is living. Because what happens over time is that populations in some states and some districts decline, in other places it increases. And so if there's an increase in the population in states in the South, then they get more representatives in Congress. If there's decreasing population, say in the North or Northeast, or the Rust Belt states they call the Midwest, places like Michigan or Wisconsin or Illinois, if their populations decline, then they lose seats in Congress. And as the overall population increases, eventually there will be more seats added to Congress as well. And so the thing is that every 10 years, the census then is published and it shows where the population has moved to. Has population gone up or down? If there's a congressional district that has lost population, then it needs to be redrawn so that it has smaller borders, or it has to be redrawn so that it takes in more people so that it has about roughly the same number of people. The courts decided that congressional districts have to have roughly the same number of voters in them, but they don't have to be contiguous. That is, they don't have to be rational. They don't have to follow county lines. They don't have to follow any straight lines. They don't even have to be very clearly organized. They can spread out over wide territories, and they can curve around, they can bend around places, they can include parts of cities, but exclude other parts of the cities. They can include parts of counties. They can add rural and urban areas. They can add places that have majority white population with places that have a majority minority population. You can do all kinds of things like this. A case in 2009 by the Supreme Court ruled that the gerrymandering was not something that the courts should be involved in. The gerrymandering was not unconstitutional because it is something that says the Congress says, or the Constitution says, that states get to decide how people vote. And so it's left up to state governments. So go back to our chart before, you see these states where Republicans control both houses of their legislature. Those are the houses that are drawing up the new plans for congressional districts. So in states like Texas, where you've got about 90% of the population increase in Texas over the last 10 years has been among Hispanics. 90% of Texas's increased population is among Hispanics since 2010. Well, Texas is controlled by Republicans, and they want to maintain Republican control because Republican control in Texas means white control. And so what they've done is redrawn districts. They've come up with a new plan. Now it's gone into effect that will be in effect for the 2022 elections. Look down here in the lower left, here's a map of Texas. It shows you the current map. This was of 2020. This is before the 2020 elections, before the census led to the redistricting. What they had before was 36 districts. Safe districts, there were 8 solid Democratic districts. That is 8 districts that would be Democratic basically no matter what. The Democrats had the majority population. These are places around Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, El Paso. There were 11 districts that were safe Republican districts. These are basically around Amarillo, Lubbock, and rural districts outside of the big cities there. That meant then that there were 2 that kind of leaned Democratic, but could be challenged by the Republicans, 3 that were leaned Republican, but the Democrats might have a chance of winning those occasionally. And there were 12 districts in here that were up for grabs. 12 districts. That meant the Republicans and Democrats could compete for all these 12 districts. And notice most of these are out here southwest of San Antonio, down to Laredo, out towards El Paso there. Some of them around Dallas, some extent around Houston, around the cities. These are areas where there's a rough mix of Republicans and Democrats. And these are areas in which they were competing. Well, the Republicans who control the state legislature have redistricted the state after the 2020 election for the 2022 election now. So now there are 38 districts in Texas. In population increase, they got 2 more districts. Those districts are taken out of somebody else. What they got now of this map, you'll notice what happened to those gray areas there. There were 12 areas, districts that were up for grabs. That was 1 district up for grabs. Now there are 22 that are safe Republican districts out of previous 11. Now they're 22. So they've doubled the size of their safe majority. The Democratic majority has also increased somewhat from 8 to 12 safe districts. But you'll notice that they get 1 leaning Democratic. The Republicans get 2 leaning Republicans. So the Republicans now have 24 solid districts, pretty much. Democrats, 13. 1 to compete for. So even if the Democrats win that means 14. That gives the Republicans a majority in their congressional district, the congressional delegation. That means that basically the majority of Texas representatives in the House of Representatives will be Republican going forward. Another example here, North Carolina. This one ended up in the courts, where the courts decided that the state could redistrict its own, do whatever it wanted to, gerrymandering here. You'll notice that there are 4 of them here. Go back to this lower right-hand one here, 2008 map. You had 8 Democratic districts, 5 Republican. Those are safe districts here. 2016 election, when the Republicans took over the North Carolina legislature, they redrew the districts at that point and gave 10 safe Republican districts to 3 Democratic districts, meaning that North Carolina was pretty much guaranteed to have now a Republican congressional delegation. HB 1029, which is used in 2020, now has changed that. They went to court and the court forced them to change some of that. But it's still got 8 safe Republican and 5 safe Democratic districts. You notice 2008, it was 8 Democrat, 5 Republican. 2020, it's 8 Republican, 5 Democratic. Okay, voter suppression, as I mentioned, is the other long-term strategy to be used by the Republican Party. What they're doing basically is trying to restrict the voting of people who will vote Democratic. That means particularly minorities, African Americans, Hispanic minorities, Asian Americans. Now, what the voter suppression laws are about is ways that would make it more difficult to vote. There are a variety of voter suppression tactics we talked about earlier in the semester, so I won't bore you with all those again. Things like voter ID, reducing the time for early voting, making it more difficult to do absentee or mail-in voting, those kind of things. Particularly photo IDs are one of the real popular ways of suppressing the vote. And notice here that in 18 states, there are now strict photo ID requirements. Constitution does not require you to show identification when you vote. And most states more recently did not require ID. This is something that's a modern day form of Jim Crow laws that basically discriminates against African Americans and Latinos, Native Americans, who are not as likely as whites to have some form of state issued voter photo ID, a driver's license or a state ID or a passport. Whites are more likely to have those. And so they know that if you require a photo ID, that means more whites are likely to vote. More whites means more likely a Republican victory. There are a lot of states like New York and in New England that have no ID requirements at all. You go in to vote in New York, as I have been doing for the last 24 years. I just go in and tell them my name. They look me up in a book. There's a piece of paper there that has my name and my signature on it. I sign my signature next to my name and my signature. They compare the two. They give me a ballot and I go vote. But increasingly in states that are dominated by Republicans, places like Texas, the South there, that are requiring strict voter ID requirements there. And we also noticed that in the wake of the 2020 election, when the Republicans lost the election, the presidential election, they followed up by filing a variety of voter suppression laws across the country, particularly in Republican-controlled states, but also in places like New York. These are bills that were introduced into the legislature by Republican members of the legislature. Most of these 106 bills have gone nowhere. They've not been enacted, but they have been enacted in a number of them, like Georgia, Texas, in these Republican-dominated states. They're also changing the rules about who counts ballots and who certifies elections. They're trying to take it out of the hands of a nonpartisan or bipartisan office and put it into the hands of the legislature, which they figure will be dominated by Republicans due to gerrymandering. And so that way they can have a partisan certification of the elections. And if they feel like they don't want to certify the Democratic victor, they can simply refuse and instead certify a Republican victor for that state, thus changing the way the Electoral College votes are counted and how the certification of the presidential election will happen in 2024. So see how this happens. 2024 will know if the Republicans have been successful in their efforts at gerrymandering and voter suppression, and that will tell us a lot about what's likely to happen in the future of the United States as we move forward and trying to deal with issues that are of serious national concern, particularly climate change and global warming, and how successful we will be at that. So that's what I have to say for today. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining me this semester. I hope you've learned something in this course, and I hope you found these videos entertaining or at least informative. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to talk with you. I still have my office hours on Tuesdays, or I can meet anytime. Just let me know a good time or day for you to meet. Thank you. Good luck with everything. Good luck with your finals. Good luck with your papers. Good luck with the rest of the semester. Happy holidays to you, and hope everything goes great in the new year. Take care.